Bill Tripp spent 11 years in government meeting rooms warning this would happen. On November 8, 2018, he watched the smoke column rise and knew he had been right. The campfire burned 153,000 acres and killed 85 people. That is larger than the entire city of Chicago plus its suburbs, gone in days. And somewhere in the ash was the proof of everything Tripp had been trying to say. 11 years. Not one fire lit. This is a story about controlled burns, Karuk knowledge, and one man's war with a system that chose paper over forest. Bill Tripp is the Director of Natural Resources for the Karuk tribe of Northern California. That title does not mean what most people picture when they hear it. He is not a ceremonial figure. He is not a spokesperson. He runs federal negotiations, interprets fire behavior models, and writes ecosystem assessments. He holds both formal environmental science training and knowledge passed through his family lineage, generation by generation. 2 systems of understanding land, and he carries both of them into every room he walks into. The Karuk people have lived along the Klamath River in Northern California for thousands of years. Their territory, deep canyon country, dense tan oak forest, river corridors that run cold, even in August. You can smell the difference between Klamath forest and managed timberland, damp earth, decomposing leaf matter, the faint resin of old-growth fir. The Karuk did not passively inhabit this landscape. They shaped it. For 10,000 years, they used fire the way a careful farmer uses a plow. Deliberately, seasonally, with purpose. 10,000 years. If this knowledge were a written book, it would predate the Egyptian pyramids by 5,000 years. Specific ridgelines were burned on 3-year cycles, certain riparian zones every 7 years. These were not guesses. These were site-specific prescriptions, geographically mapped in oral history, and passed from elder to child to grandchild. Tripp's grandfather walked these same slopes. Tripp knows which ones. He can name them. The low-intensity fires cleared competing brush, opened the forest floor to light, and kept the tan oak trees healthy. The tan oak is not a decorative tree. It is a food system. Acorns from tan oak groves formed the core of Karuk diet for generations. Ground into flour, leached, cooked, stored. A healthy tan oak stand is, functionally, a grocery store that restocks itself every autumn. Without periodic fire, Douglas fir moves in. Fast-growing, shade-casting, relentless. Douglas fir does not produce food for the Karuk. It just takes the light. And without light, the tan oak dies. This is not metaphor. This is documented, peer-reviewed, measurable ecology. But what happened to all of that fire, and why it stopped? That is the part most people do not know. 1850. California becomes a state, and the policy that follows is systematic and fast. Karuk burning practices across Northern California are criminalized, not discouraged, not regulated, criminalized. Note: the very act that had maintained forest health for 10,000 years becomes illegal within a single generation. Federal and state authorities frame fire suppression as progress, as civilization replacing chaos. What they were actually doing was dismantling a land management system they did not understand and had not bothered to study. For the Karuk people, this was not only an ecological loss, it was inseparable from the suppression of their sovereignty itself. Taking away the fire meant taking away the food. Taking away the food meant taking away the people's ability to remain on the land. Imagine a city that banned street sweeping for 100 years, then blamed a flood on the rain. That is California's wildfire crisis. 100 years of accumulated fuel igniting all at once. Bill Tripp's family knew the sweeping schedule. Nobody asked them. 100 years of silence. The forest did not stay silent. It accumulated. Brush built up in layers. Dead wood piled against standing trees. Canopy closed until almost no light reached the ground. Every year of suppression was another year of fuel waiting for a match. And while the fuel built, the tan oak stands were quietly collapsing. Douglas fir expanded measurably across the Klamath region, documented in peer-reviewed research conducted in partnership with the Karuk and Yurok tribes. The pantry that had fed Tripp's ancestors for generations was being erased tree by tree. Bill Tripp grew up watching this happen. He grew up knowing what was being lost and why. He chose to become the person who would fight to reverse it, not through protest, but through the system itself. In 2007, Tripp began formal negotiations with the U.S. Forest Service Six Rivers National Forest. He wanted to reintroduce cultural burns in the Klamath River watershed. He came prepared: environmental science credentials, ecological data, traditional knowledge documentation, and the specific burn histories his family had carried for generations. He sat down across from federal land managers and made his case. What happened next, the part the press releases never mentioned, is where the real story lives. The permits. Tripp later described the bureaucratic barrier not as outright hostility, but as death by 1,000 permits. Each proposed cultural burn required air quality waivers from the California Air Resources Board. It required Forest Service coordination across multiple districts. It required liability clearances, county fire official sign-offs, and state agency approvals. Each of those approvals came from a different office, on a different timeline, with a different set of forms. And each one had to be renewed, or refiled, or resubmitted if conditions changed. A 40-acre burn plan for a single tan oak stand could take 14 months to approve. In those 14 months, the stand accumulated another year of suppressed fuel. The irony was not subtle. The system designed to manage fire risk was making fire more dangerous by preventing the only thing that actually reduced it. Commercial timber companies did not face the same obstacle course. Their paperwork moved faster. Their liability exposure was lower. The system that called itself neutral was structurally tilted against the people who had been doing this work for 10,000 years. Tripp kept filing. Tripp kept sitting in those fluorescent-lit rooms. He kept making the case. Picture the room: a folding table, government-issued chairs, overhead lighting that washes color from everything. Tripp with his burn maps and his oral history documentation and his scientific data stacked in front of him. Across the table, well-meaning bureaucrats who genuinely did not know what they did not know. That is perhaps the hardest part of this story to sit with. Most of the people who blocked these burns were not villains. They were people following systems built by people who had already decided indigenous knowledge was not real knowledge. The decision had been made in 1850. Tripp was still paying for it in 2017. And then November came. November 8, 2018. Butte County, California. A transmission line fault in the early morning wind. The campfire ignited and ran. And then it kept running. 85 people died. The town of Paradise was functionally erased. Crown fire moving faster than vehicles on evacuation routes. The fuel load that drove it was 168 years of accumulated suppression. Bill Tripp was in Karuk territory, to the northwest, when the smoke column rose over the ridge. A column visible across northern California, hundreds of miles of gray-brown sky made solid. He had spent 11 years in conference rooms, saying this exact outcome was preventable. The smoke did not surprise him. That is the worst part. Not the shock of seeing it, the recognition. He told High Country News that watching landscapes his grandfather had managed burn in uncontrollable wildfire was not just an ecological loss. He called it a desecration. That word is specific and chosen. A desecration is not an accident. It is a violation of something sacred by forces that refuse to see it as sacred. The ridgelines his grandfather walked, the tan oak stands that fed his family's family, the specific slopes with their specific burn cycles, held in oral memory for generations, burning now not in the low, careful way fire is supposed to move, but in a crown fire that touched nothing lightly. There is a smell to crown fire that people who have been near it do not forget. Not the campfire smell of controlled combustion, something heavier, resin and soil, and the particular acrid note of bark burning too fast and too hot. Tripp knew what was burning. He could map it from memory, and he knew that the people in Paradise had paid with their lives for a policy decision made 168 years before any of them were born. Enough. After the campfire, Tripp did not retreat. He escalated. He began testifying before California legislative committees with a directness that the prior decade of careful negotiation had not allowed. His argument was not a request. It was a statement of documented fact. The fire crisis was not a climate surprise. It was the direct consequence of criminalizing Karuk land stewardship. He was not proposing an experiment. He was describing a proven system that the state had forcibly shut down and was now paying for having never shut down. The framing mattered. For years, cultural burns had been discussed as a supplemental tool, something to add to the existing management framework. Tripp was saying something harder to hear. The existing management framework was the problem. Karuk fire knowledge is not a supplement to Western forest science. It is what Western forest science has been slowly, expensively rediscovering for 50 years. It is science done earlier, tested longer, and proven at a scale no modern experiment can match. By 2013, the Karuk and Yurok tribes, working with researchers at UC Berkeley, had co-authored ecosystem assessments documenting exactly how 150 years of fire suppression had increased catastrophic fuel loads across the Klamath region. Peer-reviewed, published, cited, ignored by the permitting system that continued to demand 14-month approval cycles. That research documented something else. Reintroduced burns produce measurable ecological recovery within 3 to 5 years. 3 to 5 years, faster than the average California home mortgage refinancing process. The knowledge works. The barrier is the system. 2019. Tripp is in Sacramento. He is not delivering an academic paper. He is testifying in front of legislators who watched 85 people die and are now, finally, listening differently. He tells them about the permit system. He tells them about the liability exposure. He tells them that individual tribal members conducting cultural burns were personally financially responsible if a burn escaped containment. Commercial foresters operating prescribed burns did not carry that same personal liability. A Karuk elder who carried generations of accumulated fire knowledge was one escaped burn away from personal financial ruin. That is a policy that makes traditional burning nearly impossible for the people most qualified to do it. The legislators were quiet in a way that rooms are quiet when something has finally been said clearly enough. And here is where the evidence gets harder to ignore, because the story of what Tripp had to overcome to get that moment in that room is a story about what it costs to carry knowledge that a system has spent 150 years trying to erase. The Karuk oral histories contain specific fire return intervals for specific places. A particular ridgeline above the Klamath. Burn it every 3 years. A riparian zone near a specific bend in the river. Every 7. These are site-specific ecological prescriptions derived from direct observation and outcome tracking across generations. Researchers now call this category of knowledge traditional ecological knowledge calendars. Western forest science invented a name for what Tripp's grandfather already knew. Tripp carries this calendar in his memory alongside his fire behavior modeling software. He walks into a Forest Service meeting able to show satellite data and oral history documentation for the same ridge. And he still spent 14 months waiting on permits. There is a weight to that, knowing exactly what to do and being required to wait while the problem grows. 55 pounds. Pick up a loaded travel bag. Carry it in both hands across every room you walk into for 11 years. That is, closer to it. 2021. Governor Newsom signs Assembly Bill 642 into law. The bill creates a prescribed burn certification board and provides meaningful liability protection for certified burn practitioners. For the first time, a Karuk elder conducting a cultural burn has legal protection similar to what commercial operators had long taken for granted. Tripp had identified this specific protection as essential as far back as 2007. It took 14 years and the deadliest wildfire in California history to get it passed. 14 years. The bill explicitly acknowledges tribal fire knowledge, not as supplemental information, but as a recognized system of land stewardship. That language mattered. It was not courtesy language. It was a statement that the knowledge Tripp carried had legal standing. For the Karuk people, this was not just a fire policy change. It was an acknowledgement of sovereignty. Restoring the burns was never only about fuel loads. It was about the right of the Karuk people to continue stewarding the land that their relationship with fire had created. The suppression of cultural burning in 1850 was not a separate policy from the suppression of Karuk nationhood. They were the same act. Restoring the burns was therefore also, always, an act of restoration for the people themselves. 2022. The Karuk and Yurok tribes conduct collaborative cultural burns across portions of their combined ancestral territory. Tripp's department coordinates the burns. USDA Forest Service researchers document the results. The fire moves the way fire is supposed to move. Slow, low, deliberate. It moves through dry grass and tan oak litter, keeping to the understory, clearing competing brush without touching the crowns above. The tan oak canopy remains. The Douglas fir encroachment gets pushed back. In the areas burned, the forest floor shifts within a single season, light reaching the ground, new grass coming through the ash, the specific ecological conditions that allow tan oak regeneration to begin. You can hear the difference in a forest that has been carefully burned. Birds return faster than you expect. Insects first, then quick movements higher up in the understory. Life does not wait long when the conditions are right. One of the burns happens on a ridge that Tripp can name from family memory. His grandfather burned this slope. Tripp does not describe this moment in abstract terms. He has said publicly that this is where the knowledge lives, not in papers, not in databases, but in the specific geography of specific places, tended by specific families across generations. This is the most revealing part of this story. Not the legislation, not the peer review, but this. A man setting fire to a hillside his grandfather set fire to, in the way his grandfather taught, on the schedule his grandfather kept, after spending 11 years fighting for the legal right to do what his family had done for generations before the law took it away. And here is what Bill Tripp has said, in his own words, about what that knowledge is. Not a paraphrase. His words. We've been doing this for 10,000 years. This isn't a new idea. This is just an idea that was illegal for 150 years. That sentence contains everything. Not anger, though anger would be earned. Not despair, though despair would be understandable. Just the plain, flat statement of a man who has been carrying the proof the whole time and is tired of being asked to prove it again. Tripp has testified publicly that Karuk cultural burns would have kept fuel loads at levels that prevent crown fire behavior of that scale. That is a statement grounded in generations of outcome data and confirmed by peer-reviewed post-fire analysis. The families who lost someone in Paradise did not lose them because California had a drought. They lost them because California spent 168 years refusing to maintain its own forests. That distinction is not abstract. It has names and addresses. The work that Tripp and the Karuk tribe built has not stayed inside their territory. The USDA Forest Service co-stewardship agreement model that Tripp's work helped influence now serves as a template cited in at least 5 other tribal fire co-management negotiations across California and Oregon. 8 other California tribes are now pursuing formal cultural burn programs modeled in part on the Karuk framework. The knowledge is moving. Slowly, but it is moving. The tan oak stands that were disappearing under Douglas fir encroachment are showing early signs of recovery in areas where burns have been reintroduced. 3 to 5 years of reintroduced burning produces measurable ecological recovery. That is documented. The acorn crop on recovered tan oak stands is literal food returning to a landscape that was being starved. The grocery store is restocking, a little, in the places the permits came through. As of 2024, California faces another above-average wildfire season forecast. The permit backlog that Tripp identified in 2007 remains only partially resolved, despite AB 642. The structural delays are smaller. They are not gone. The system has been reformed at the edges. Its core architecture, designed by people who did not believe Karuk knowledge was knowledge, is still partially in place. Tripp is still in the rooms, still negotiating, still walking the ridgelines between burn seasons with the maps his grandfather made in memory. This is not a story with a clean ending. It is a story in progress. The question California has to answer is not whether Tripp's knowledge works. That has been answered by generations of practice, by peer-reviewed research published in journals, and by the measurable recovery of burned stands. The question is whether the system will move fast enough to matter. Because the fuel is still building in the places the permits have not reached. and the next campfire is not a possibility. It is a scheduled event, waiting on a wind. The knowledge to prevent it is alive. It survived 150 years of criminalization. It survived federal fire suppression policy. It survived the systematic dismantling of Karuk sovereignty. It survived because people like Tripp's grandfather walked those ridges and handed it to people like Tripp, who carried it into every fluorescent lit room and every legislative hearing and every 4-hour permit review meeting. That is a specific inheritance passed hand to hand across generations through a system that was actively trying to end the lineage. The tan oak still knows what it needs. The fire still knows how to move low and slow when someone who knows what they're doing sets it. Bill Tripp is still working, still filing, still burning what he can, where the permit's clear. One ridge at a time, one tan oak stand at a time. On a slope his grandfather burned, the acorns are coming back. If you live in California, the forest that will either burn or hold this year is part of this story. The people who know how to keep it from burning have been waiting for you to understand that for a very long time. The link to the Karuk Tribe Department of Natural Resources and the sources used in this documentary are in the description below. This knowledge does not belong in a library. It belongs in the forest, moving low and slow, the way fire moves when someone who loves the land is the one holding the torch. And the next campfire is not a possibility. It is a scheduled event, waiting on a wind. The knowledge to prevent it is alive. It survived 150 years of criminalization. It survived federal fire suppression policy. It survived the systematic dismantling of Karuk sovereignty. It survived because people like Tripp's grandfather walked those ridges and handed it to people like Tripp, who carried it into every fluorescent lit room and every legislative hearing and every 4-hour permit review meeting. That is not resilience as an abstraction. Still walking the ridgelines between burn seasons with the maps his grandfather made in memory. This is not a story with a clean ending. It is a story in progress. The question California has to answer is not whether Tripp's knowledge works. That has been answered by 10,000 years of practice and by peer-reviewed research published in journals and by the measurable recovery of burned stands. It survived because people like Tripp's grandfather walked those ridges and handed it to people like Tripp, who carried it into every fluorescent lit room and every legislative hearing and every 4-hour permit review meeting. If you live in California, the forest that will either burn or hold this year is part of this story. The people who know how to keep it from burning have been waiting for you to understand that for a very long time. Subscribe if you want to keep following stories like this one, stories where the answer already existed and someone had to spend a career proving it. The link to the Karuk Tribe Department of Natural Resources and the sources used in this documentary are in the description below. This knowledge does not belong in a library. It belongs in the forest, moving low and slow, the way fire moves when someone who loves the land is the one holding the torch.